Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? We have a news-driven episode today. Two big stories for the two biggest parts of our audience, MAHA and public health. And we are joined by voices today from both. First, the political earthquake rocking MAHA as Republican representative from Kentucky, Thomas Massie, is defeated. The congressman is loved by MAHA, and he was taken down by President Trump and MAGA. Today, we speak with supporters of MAHA. Since the results were announced, we've been hearing from tons of people in our MAHA community, and they feel gutted. And then the other big news story. With the outbreak of Ebola and Hantavirus, we have two global public health leaders joining the conversation. Are these two outbreaks a test of preparedness for the next pandemic? And if it is, are we failing? And we'll ask our MAHA guests, given our algorithm-driven news today, is this story even reaching them? And if it is, what do they think? We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to do something kind of weird today, which is we're going to take on two big news topics, and they are seemingly unrelated. But it gets at two really big themes that we've been tracking here. One, political, and the other, public health related, pandemic related. We've got two public health experts joining us, along with a group of MAHA supporters, including somebody who was the director of field operations for the Kennedy campaign. And we want to bring them together to help us make sense of both of these stories. But first, who are we? I'm Brinda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And Dr. Mark will be back next time. And as always, reach out to us. Send us your thoughts, your questions, your comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net.
Yeah, so like we said, we have a chock full, very newsy show today. It kind of reminds me of our days at ABC and at CBS, Tom.
Yeah.
I don't know that we ever drop F-bombs as much. Maybe we did like off camera.
In the newsroom.
In the newsroom, yes. So we want to tell you a little bit about our guests. So first up, we have Dr. Nahid Badilia. Dr. Badilia is an infectious disease physician and an associate professor at Boston University School of Medicine, where she is the founding director of the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases Policy and Research. She served as senior policy advisor for the global COVID-19 response for the White House COVID team and has provided direct patient care during multiple Ebola outbreaks in Africa. Next, we have a good friend of the show. He's been on multiple times, Dr. Craig Spencer. Craig, as you know, is an emergency medicine physician and associate professor at Brown School of Public Health, where he focuses on frontline pandemic preparedness around the world. Craig brings a uniquely personal perspective to this conversation because in 2014, while treating Ebola patients in Guinea with Doctors Without Borders, he himself contracted the disease. And we're also thrilled to be joined by a few supporters of the Make America Healthy Again movement. Our good friend, Aaron Everett. He is a video journalist. He is a Substacker for Besides the Revolution, which is his own Substack, as well as House and Habit, which is a big Substack for Jessica Reed Krause. And he also worked for the Kennedy campaign. We have Elizabeth Frost, who's a political organizer, co-founder of MAHA Ohio, also worked for the Kennedy campaign as a grassroots organizer for the state of Ohio. And we have Jeff Hutt, who was the former national field director for the Kennedy campaign. He also was a spokesperson for the MAHA PAC. And so the three of them are here as well. So to kick things off, let us start first with the defeat of Thomas Massie. First, just some background. Tom, what do we need to know?
So yeah, just again, we're talking Republican Congressman Thomas Massie. He's one of Trump's most vocal Republican critics. And last night he was defeated by the president's handpicked candidate, Ed Gallerin, by a margin of roughly 55% to 45%. So it wasn't close in this primary race in Kentucky. The race became the most expensive House primary in congressional history. And of course, Massie has challenged the president on a whole range of issues, from the conflict in Iran to the release of the Epstein files, where, he was one of those Republicans pushing the hardest for the disclosure of those files. And he also championed issues that really get to the heart of the MAHA movement, including very visibly, very vocally, his opposition to glyphosate and to the president's glyphosate executive order, sort of protecting production of of the herbicide. And Massey even introduced legislation aimed at stripping pesticide manufacturers of certain legal immunity protections. President Trump called Massey, quote, the worst congressman in the history of our country, and deployed a massive political effort to defeat him.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough what a complete earthquake, as we said, this is. My phone has been blowing up over the last 12 hours. And it's not just Republicans or MAHA supporters, it's Democrats and independents as well. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Tom. Shifting gears. So I know this is like a big pivot, but from our perspective, like we said, these are two big stories that are playing out in the two communities that we really invite on the show a lot. So we wanted to honor both these conversations today. So we have these two outbreaks of infectious disease that are making the headlines. Tom, just remind us kind of what's up with this.
Yeah, just briefly, we're talking hantavirus, that sort of came first in our chronology here. 9 confirmed cases among passengers of that cruise ship, including 3 deaths. There's dozens of suspected cases. There's different strains of hantavirus. Here we're talking about the Andes strain, which importantly can be spread from person to person as versus other strains that can't. The CDC calculates a 35% death rate among those infected. And Maggie did the math, and that makes it approximately 35 times more deadly than that first wave of COVID we experienced back in 2020. That's why it's got people's attention. Then, and perhaps even more troubling, we have an Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The WHO has sounded the alarm over the scale and speed of the outbreak. So far, we have 134 deaths. We have 500 plus suspected cases. And again, that's just a snapshot of what's known now, and that's troubling at this point. The pacing speaks to this outbreak being large. This is a less commonly encountered strain, which authorities say led to the spread going undetected for 2 weeks. That was not good. There's also no approved vaccines or treatments for this strain. And like hantavirus, Ebola is extremely deadly. We're talking about a death rate of around 50%. And like hantavirus, early symptoms can go unrecognized. Sometimes they're mistaken for things like malaria, and that fuels the spread.
Yeah, and Maggie, just tell me, like, real quick, what is something you're excited to talk about with Craig and Naheed in this conversation? Like, what do you think is important for us to just sort of, be mindful of?
Yeah, I think that both of these topics are really near and dear to my heart. They're emerging infectious diseases that we're concerned about. And this is one of the reasons I reached out to you in the first place, Brinda, was I was seeing things in public health, but I wasn't sure if they were penetrating out beyond that. We've had outbreaks of Ebola every year, and so I want to get from Craig and Naheed what their perspective is on what their concerns are, if we foresee something, if things are in place, especially with the cutting of USAID, with us pulling out of the World Health Organization. How prepared are we compared to previous points in history?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So the way this is going to go is we're going to have the guests kind of self-introduce, tell us a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to get into the conversation. So coming right up, we are going to have our conversation with our friends from MAHA and Public Health. We're going to talk Thomas Massie. We're going to talk Ebola, and it's all going to be related somehow. Coming right up.
My name is Elizabeth Frost. I worked for the RFK Jr. presidential campaign in the summer of 2024 as the state director in Ohio. And following that, I co-founded MAHA Ohio. We're going to talk about Thomas Massie, who is someone that has occupied a lot of my brainwaves over, honestly, the past probably 2 years. And we're also here to talk about Ebola. This is going to be an exciting conversation today for me as someone who's kind of born and raised in the Ohio River Valley region of Appalachia. I've seen a lot of things go wrong in public health response. So I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of notes.
My name is Craig Spencer. I am an emergency physician and I teach public health at the Brown University School of Public Health. I am from the Midwest, Detroit, born and raised, and spent most of the 2010s working abroad, primarily in East and West Africa, Southeast Asia, as well as an epidemiologist, as a physician, as a kind of responder to humanitarian crises. Yeah, I once had Ebola, which I don't recommend in 2015.
Yes. Hello, my name's Jeff Hutt. I live in South Texas, which we consider the real part of Texas. I was the national field director for the RFK Jr. campaign for about 6 months, January through June. I'm also a member of the Republican Liberty Caucus, which is on the national board and also the state board. So my kind of fit in here, hopefully, is looking at the political landscape. I'm really happy to be here. This is really remnant back to the old Kennedy days when we would have political wonks and health wonks on the on Zoom calls, and we would trying to learn about what's going on, and it was this amazing group of people. So this is like coming back home in a sense to me.
Good morning. Thanks, guys, for having me. My name is Nahid Badalia. I'm an infectious diseases physician, and my whole life is emerging infectious diseases. I feel like I've been thinking and doing this since college, basically. I knew I wanted to do this. And for the last 15-something years, I've been part of the U.S. preparedness for protecting our communities against emerging pathogens. Like Craig, was deployed in West Africa, but in a different country because I don't speak French.
Hi, I'm Aaron Everett, and I write for something called Besides the Revolution, which is my own Substack. Kind of musings and thoughts about politics and all sorts of things, actually. Just kind of, I'm fascinated by history. I'm fascinated by our current moment. I think I'm in this conversation because I tend to be a little bit more on the liberty side of life in terms of politics.
So my first question is about Thomas Massie and his primary defeat last night. You know, I'd love to start with you, Aaron. You know, you texted me last night. We actually spoke on the phone. Tell us what your reaction is. And also, I'd love to just learn, like, why is Thomas Massie such a significant figure in MAHA? And I would love to, you know, throw that to the bigger group as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, Massie is a super interesting character. He's kind of this leftover from the Tea Party, which, you know, he was a pretty young guy when all of that was going on, and ultimately becomes a part of Congress, and then starts to become a voice that I think a lot of people really resonated with. I mean, from the MAHA perspective, or sort of even Kennedy adjacent people, he was pretty compelling because he understands agriculture, regenerative agriculture for sure, but also just has this kind of these instincts about money and debt and how dysfunctional Washington ultimately is. And he's probably one of the only voices that really consistently called that out over his career. Now, you know, the last little bit, it's been a war with Trump, and I think he went to battle with him over some things that ultimately cost him this primary race. And some of that is, you know, that's going to be part of this discussion that I think is harder to have. But, you know, he took on some things that I just don't think you take on in American politics. I think he touched some things that really made people frustrated by him. And Trump was able to characterize him in a way in which those that watch Fox News, all the demographic over 70, were able to understand, you know, like they heard one particular side of this conversation, and they were the ones that got out and voted. And that's how primaries work in the United States. The boomers pick our people, and that's because they've got a lot of time on their hands, and they also are activists. And so that's what we kind of are in this moment, I think. You know, it's super sad. He's my favorite congressman. A lot of things. I think he's got way too much to offer to have this be the end of his career. So I think there'll be other opportunities for Massie in other ways. Last night's defeat doesn't necessarily surprise me. I mean, you take on Trump, you're going to lose. He's the voice of the party, and he's, you know, like him or hate him, Trump's a great politician and understands what his levers are. And he used them all to finish this up last night.
Aaron, can I share what you texted me last night?
Yeah.
You said, Brinda, I'm losing it.
Oh, part of me just has there's this underlying and undercurrent of remorse about the whole thing. Politics is such a terrible deal.
Remorse about what, Aaron?
Well, you get to pick two, right? So I still wouldn't have done anything differently than I did given how things all played out. But I feel responsible to some degree that I felt like I was an advocate for Trump when actually at the end of the day, I was an advocate for Kennedy. And I wanted him to be the president. I wanted him to win. I don't think Trump is nearly as conservative as everybody in X or the Twitter sphere or whatever decided that he was going to be and projected upon him. He's not an ideologue, never has been, he's got all sorts of bad instincts, even though they're supposed to be legendary. And he certainly has bad instincts as it relates to being somebody who's a little bit more on the liberty life type stuff. I think he just doesn't have those instincts. I think he likes big government, and I think he likes spending money, and I think he just loves the show. And I like that's who he is. And
you said you're super sad. Are you super done? Is this union over? Like this?
It's been crumbling for a while.
I know it's crumbling. You wrote about it so eloquently, but like, is this the last straw? Is this it? Like, where are you? How does this fit into that evolution of Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't take much for me to be done. Honestly, the war stuff is really what got it for me. I'm an anti-war person. I've got 4 boys that are all college-age kids that are all, right in the thick of this thing. Should this go as it seems like nobody knows how this is going to go, and it just seems ill-placed, mistimed, and a bad decision. I'm not inside the room, so I can't tell you why or what he saw or why he decided that this was the most important thing and why in this 2-week period, this was when Iran was going to get their nuclear bomb after the last 30 years of that conversation. But yeah, it is sort of a done point for me, but I've kind of been there anyway. I'm not a giant fan of this current situation. And even from the Kennedy perspective, from again, observing from the outside, I don't know what's happening on the inside. I don't know everything, but I do feel like he's been limited in his ability to engage in what I think he really wanted to do. And I think he's had some handcuffs placed on him by the administration. And I think it's pretty evident. I don't think anybody, I think he might even in private say the same thing. I don't think there's anything, and I'm speculating that. I don't know anything. I haven't talked to Bobby since I saw him in Denver 2 years ago. So I don't know anything about that or have no inside information about it. But my guess is that and at least from the surface, this all feels very hamstrung and very much like this is what Trump wants. And so we're going to do what Trump does. And that's hard for me because I don't think that's good government.
Elizabeth Frost, I heard from many MAHA leaders last night. I was texting with Kelly. I was texting with Zen, and Vani Hari, the food babe, she posted this on X. She said, expect a revolt by the people. No matter what happens, it just lit a fire under an entire generation that is tired of being ignored, manipulated, and lied to. React to that. And what went through your mind when you saw the result last night?
I think Vonnie's right. I think this did light a fire under a generation, but I don't think she's talking about MAHA. I think Vonnie is actually referring to this broader coalition from the Kennedy campaign. And what I'm seeing right now, I was texting Tim Ryan about this. I feel like I'm watching this coalition that got ripped apart during when MAHA aligned with Trump and Kennedy endorsed Trump, so on. We really lost the fire under a lot of people because for so many people, probably at least 50%. Of our most passionate, driven volunteers and activists on the Kennedy campaign, they were campaigning against Trump. They were campaigning against this type of behavior. They were campaigning against war. They were campaigning against oligarchy. We're seeing so much of what ultimately inspired people to push Bobby, to a position where we held weight in that election, and our votes did matter. Our votes did sway things, And to now have our motivating factors be used against us in particularly with someone like Thomas Massie, who is so emblematic of everything I just said, and to think that if Massie didn't hold his seat in Congress during, the argument over the big beautiful bill, during the argument over the Epstein files, over, all of these matters of transparency, we would know so much less right now, I believe, if it weren't for Thomas Massie. And again, this is bigger than MAHA. This is something that I think is going to revive a coalition. To that point, I'm not just mad at Trump. I'm not just mad at AIPAC or foreign lobbies. I'm mad at us too. We left a lot on the table for Thomas Massie. I left a lot on the table for Thomas Massie. MAHA Ohio left a lot on the table for Thomas Massie. We had our own primaries going on and, races that we were worried about. And, we had some wins and we had some losses. I don't think we're going to make that mistake again.
Dr. Nahid Vidalia.
Jeff, I was going to ask you what's next, just hearing about, Elizabeth's take and Aaron's take about like the disappointment the MAHA movement is feeling after Massie, right? And it's so interesting. I completely relate. Why did we go to war with Iran? Like billions of dollars, right? Like what a waste. I am anti-war as they come. The other thing that I wonder is like, how are you guys thinking about this like 1.7 billion? We're talking about saving money, but I feel like we haven't really saved any money. Like $1.7 billion fund in the Justice Department, like, again, a lot of money just going out rather than actually being held. What happens next for MAHA? Like if truly there is a fracture between MAGA and MAHA, like where do you see your community sort of taking their energy next?
Well, I have personally, maybe this is because I'm a Southerner, but I've always been a little skeptical of the federal perspective when it comes to MAHA. I myself, my favorite area to engage in politics is county level and below, because I really think this is where the power in our lives really lie. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Massie. Like I said, I'm a Republican Liberty Caucus guy. He's really our guy. But, in my opinion, and this kind of goes back to Aaron, I think Congress is broken. Aaron mentioned about having more representation in Congress. My feeling is that Congress needs to have less power and the federal government needs to have less power. But so that kind of gets into the way I look at this. When we first left the Kennedy campaign, I was one of the folks who we did media in several of the battleground states, and I did stuff like if you want to end forever wars, vote for Trump, J.D. Vance, Kennedy, and Tulsi Gabbard, which obviously didn't come out to be. So, I have a little bit of personal pride about that too. But when we first started looking at how we were going to make inroads into the health freedom, the regenerative agriculture, we really looked and realized it's on a state level. So for me, a lot of the things that happened with Massie or happened in Washington, D.C., I'm a little bit distanced from it, because when I see like the real things that go about our lives and the real changes that we made, they need to be made in our state houses. I went, and this is a good example. We were doing after the election, we were visiting some of the conservative organizations in DC, and I spoke in front of a bunch of staffers. And I told them, I said, the best thing that you can do for us is push back and say no. And when I left that meeting, the individual who I was with was a professional lobbyist. She looked over at me and she said, you can't tell them that. They want to do something and they wanted to be active. And this is the thing about politics in Washington. People want to get stuff done. They want to feel like they have a score on the board, when really in terms of MAHA, I'm only looking for our federal government to say no, stop glyphosate. Let states do it. So in terms of the Massie thing, I really kind of felt bad for Massie for a lot of time. I appreciated what he did, right? In a way, he pulled the mask back on a lot that's going on. But I also appreciate, in a sense, his defeat in Kentucky, because I think it exposes the true levers of power in our government. And Elizabeth talked about a revolution. A revolution or a change can only happen when we perceive the world as it is and not how it wants to be. And I look around, and this is a great group. We're all around the same age or younger, but there's a whole lot of people in our country, 65, 60 and over, who probably went through the strongest propaganda of any group of people in the history of the world, post World War II up until the 2000s. And I think a lot of that facade is being broken, that we're seeing the world how it is, and now we can actually react to what's going on. So I'm sorry for Thomas Massie. Like Elizabeth said, Aaron said, he was one of our heroes on the campaign. Everybody loved him. There was talk about him being, everybody wanted him to be the vice president nominee, the pick, for the longest time. But then there's the reality of, there's what we want politically, and then there's the reality of what happens.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts that go through my mind listening to you, and you're connecting a lot of dots actually too in my mind. You said this Massie, situation really, exposes the true levers of power in our government. It sort of sounds like what you're saying is, MAHA learned last night that as a sort of a federal nationwide movement and as a sort of subset of MAGA, it actually doesn't have power there. And that was just cold reality last night. Trump just plowed through and took out, a hero of MAHA and didn't blink. There was no I don't know how this is going to play. It was just power. At the same time, you say that you would like to see, and you often think about power at the local level, which is really fascinating. And you see that as a pathway for MAHA. We are honored to be kind of in concert with MAHA folks across the country, and we're kind of like listening with them in conversations. And often I see big national news, and the conversations about this group in this county in Delaware is organizing, and we're doing something in California on this unrelated thing, and that's exciting, and send money to this thing. And I'm like, what is all this piecemeal stuff? This big thing happened, and you guys are focused on local things. And now you sort of help me understand that, which is, when this isn't working at the federal level, it's just too much to take on. Turn inwards and do what you can work on, which is your own community. Sounds like that's just underline that for us.
I think this is the idea that, back in 1776, back in the early 1800s, I think this was the political ideal that was laid out, that you have non-career politicians, you have government that's rested in your local political body. And it was only really through the rise of things such as, post-Civil War, consolidation of federal power, the income tax. It was only this time that our federal leaders and who was in office became well known. And so if we look at things really historically, it wasn't even till 1970 that the roll call vote in Congress was actually made available to the public. So let's say before then, all of these leaders kind of really got together behind closed doors and hashed out deals. So locals did not know how their elected officials voted. So everything happened in Washington. You also didn't have campaign finance reform, so you didn't see who was giving them money. It was only through really the last, I'm going to say 50 years, that we really switched from being this local oriented government to this kind of looking at the federal level. And I'll give you a good example. So my county appraisal office decides on how we do agricultural. So we are pushing on the county level an agricultural initiative to bring the size of ag exempt property down to 1.5 acres, depending upon how much you produce. And there's, you have to show that you produce and you have to show that you spend. But here we go. On the federal level, you can't encourage local urban agriculture. On the state level, you really can't do it either. but that power lies within a small body that governs an appraisal district. And if we look at our local governments, there's this idea that the perfect political state is about 30,000 people. The reason it's 30,000 people is because it gives you as an individual the ability to connect and reach out to who your elected officials are. I helped my current U.S. rep get elected back in 2018. I have his number on my cell phone, but I'd never talked to him because he can't do anything for me. But however, I have my local county commissioners. I'm friends with my city council, and these are the places where I think instead of wasting our time as groups of individuals, that we really go after the local elections and local officials, and we create a wall around us, because at the end of the day, that's the only real political agency we have. The political agency of Washington, D.C., that's just a facade that Washington has tried to convince us we have, and political consultants, which I am one, try to convince people that their vote really matters. But at the end of the day, you really get outside of a state rep, and maybe a state Senate election, you don't really have much power on government, but you have a lot of power on what you can do on a county commissioner or a county level and below.
Dr. Craig Spencer, you had a couple of thoughts as well.
Yeah, well, I think there's an important message there as well when we think about public health and we transition to that specifically from the federal to the power of the local. But can I just quickly read something that was just published by Ro Khanna, and for all intents and purposes, which should be the exact opposite of Thomas Massie, a Democrat from California. But as everybody knows, they worked really closely together on the Epstein files or getting those revealed. He said, "You may not have a home in the Trump coalition, but there's a new generation of populist Democrats, and we welcome you to help us change this country, change the rotten system, and have a politics that puts the working class ahead of the Epstein class." I think it's a good quote. I think it's probably good politics on his behalf. It makes me want to ask you all a question. If you could go back to 10 minutes before Trump gives Bobby a call and offers him a spot on the ticket, knowing what you know about the past year and a half, knowing that there have been some wins within MAHA, but I don't think there are a lot of the wins that many of you would have probably wanted. Maybe not the priorities you would have wanted, maybe not the scale you would have wanted. Seeing what you saw last night with Massie, seeing how MAHA has kind of been used, abused, and cast aside, what would you tell Bobby before that phone call, whether he should take that bargain or not? And what would you say to Ro Khanna and other Democrats right now who are offering you maybe a different home with some more MAHA-aligned policies?
Oh, boy. Who wants to take that?
I'll take a chunk of it. Okay, just a chunk. Someone else is going to have to take the rest. You asked about the phone call. I wasn't in those rooms when those conversations were happening. But my understanding is that calls were placed to both the Harris campaign and to the Trump campaign, and that we didn't get any kind of answer. We got voicemail
from the Harris.
Mm-hmm. And so it's a false dichotomy to say that we really had a choice. I don't know that there was another option.
Well, we could have stayed on the outside.
Yeah. I mean, to stay on the outside, and maybe that looks a lot more like Jeff's vision, and maybe there's more that could have been done there. But in terms of working with the Democrats at that time, we weren't welcome. And I think, to what I would say to someone like Ro Khanna, I guess I would just go with what I said to Tim Ryan last night. I asked, do you think the Democrats are actually ready to talk? Because I don't know that they are. I think Ro Khanna is. I think Tim Ryan is. I think a lot of the systemic reform, if we are thinking in this federal lens, hasn't really happened in the Democratic Party yet. And I think we're seeing a Democratic Party that's very reminiscent of where the Republican Party was before the MAHA-MAGA coalition, right? They see the benefit, they see we've got some common ground, we can probably work off of this. There's going to be certain things we don't agree on and certain areas that we don't want to touch. And so I think that leap that a lot of people are kind of watching and wondering, is this going to happen? Is MAHA going to attach itself to the left now for some political saliency in the next? I can't predict the future, but it feels like the pendulum is swinging the other way with the populist opinion in the country, and that we're probably going to see a blue wave, if not in the midterms, in the presidential. I think there's a lot of people asking things like, is it enough if they promise Bobby will stay in HHS and maybe Massie goes into USDA, or Massie, has some other position of pull in this next administration? I think a lot of people are asking those questions, but the damage that was done between MAHA and I think the institutional Democratic Party is very real. And it's almost like two bad relationships, right? It's like, okay, I got out of one bad relationship and I accidentally went into this to this next bad relationship because they don't do the things that you did, but now I'm being hurt or mistreated here. Does that mean I go back to the other guy, or does that mean we rethink it all, like Jeff is talking about? One thing I do know is that we have this grassroots energy right now that if someone can answer that question and really harness that, I think it's going to be incredible. But I do think that there needs to be someone or some organization that can provide people with direction right now on how to channel all of this emotion that they're feeling, not just about Massie, but about glyphosate, about, agriculture in general. There's so many things. I think that not just MAHA, but MAHA-minded voters are really motivated to see change right now.
And that's 40% of the electorate per recent polls. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Jeff Hutt, I would love to get your response to that excellent question from Craig about that phone call. If you could go back in time and give, and you actually were probably in the room. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
I had left the campaign after the, I was a proponent. Right. I was a proponent of get on the ballot at all costs. So I was a proponent of I had pushed towards the libertarian, trying to get the libertarian nod. It didn't happen. We didn't start so soon. But I had, starting in early July, I had been making calls within the Kennedy campaign and local Republicans about that Kennedy should get on board with Donald Trump. So, I mean, I was part of that push. And we didn't have a real choice. When Kennedy got kicked off of the ballot in New York, because he had used New York as his residency in every other single petition we had done, we would have been kicked off the ballot in all the other states too. So we really didn't have a choice. And it was interesting. I loved what Elizabeth said about why we kind of moved with the Republican Party. When we were doing petitioning, we had one of the things that we suggested our volunteers do was go to gun shows. And for a lot of our Democratic leaning and left leaning folks, they were a little bit scared at first when they got to gun shows. But Republicans were so nice to them. And Republicans really opened up to them. They treated them well. They were able to help get us signatures. On the contrary, Democrats chased us around the country, attacked us at every opportunity they could. They spit on petitioners, and then at campaign rallies, they drove around with these bus panel vans with signs on the side mocking Kennedy. So the Democrats really drove that wedge. So when Kennedy first announced, my organization was one of the groups who was out of the Kennedy campaign came this kind of directive about vote for Kennedy where Kennedy is on the ballot. But vote where he's not, vote for Donald Trump. And I was a big pusher of no, wherever a vote for Trump is a vote for Kennedy. And I like what has happened. I I never wanted our movement to become attached to the Republican Party. And I don't think that was where our natural inclination laid. And I think we need to acknowledge that there's really two MAHAs when we talk about it. There's kind of MAHA grassroots, and there's institutional MAHA. And institutional MAHA is connected with Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And because it reflects down on the rest of us. What I would really like to see is that, and I've always wanted to do this, is that we form a caucus, kind of a fulcrum caucus, and that we're looking to vote for parties and candidates who best represent us. So in the next election, I'm personally hoping that we see a lot of MAHA voters cause pain to the Republicans for this. And if we can cause pain to the Republicans, we can signal, one, to the Republicans that this is what happens when you make promises to these group of independent-minded voters and you don't deliver. And it also will allow Democrats, because a lot of our home, the MAHA home, a lot of the MAHA home, they were Democrats originally. So there's a natural place. And I think that the best thing that we can do is we look at actual candidates themselves. We don't get ourselves wrapped up into a party ideology, and we force these political parties to change their platforms to come after our vote.
Jeff, yes or no question, yes
yes.
or no answer. Is RFK Jr. the leader of MAHA?
No.
Got it.
Nicole Shanahan is.
Wait, explain that.
I think she redirected that Kennedy energy back into what became MAHA. I really think she's an unsung hero. For me, it's unfortunate that since the election, she's kind of moved onto the sideline. But I got nothing but great things to say about her.
That is so fascinating. I'm going to pivot us, and here's how I'm going to pivot us. We've had some interesting conversations here about federal and local. And I can see a real enthusiasm, particularly amongst our friends from MAHA, for really doubling down on local and maybe not having as much faith in federal. And here we have two public health experts who one of them worked at the federal level. They've both worked with governments. And I think in some ways, I imagine for the two of you, Craig and Naheed, I mean, can you imagine doing what you do without federal support? So I'd first like to start with Naheed, which is to sort of help us frame what's happening with Ebola and Hanta and why you think federal is in fact really crucial in this case, if you think that.
I think they both are. I don't think, most people don't realize how much public health is done by your local public health departments, by your state departments of public health, but without the coordination on the federal level, it would make it harder, and without the resources, because you don't need every capacity all the time. And so having that backstop, having something like a CDC that provides that background is important. But that's very different than what Jeff is saying. By the way, Jeff, I could listen to you all day long. And also, can I invite you to one of my classes so you can talk to my students to get them excited about voting and being part of local politics? And I also wanted to I've been dying to comment on this, comments about, the Democratic Party. I just want to say, I don't think the Democratic coalition's ever been monolithic, and I don't think it's that monolithic. In fact, it's quite fractured. And I think the strain that at least I feel is, again, that division between populist versus old party, very similar to what you're seeing, across the party lines. And again, now I'm going to say something that's going to make you hate me, but bear with me. I think you'll agree with me. The reason why you can hate Mamdani for everything he stands for and everything he does, but the reason he brings so much energy is he's demonstrating exactly what Jeff is saying, which is that politicians should serve the cities they're in. They should be providing, care and caring for the issues for that. It's so interesting that we've lost sight of that. Our politicians shouldn't be just kowtowing to the bigger federal party that they're part of, that their first goal should be where they're at. And the second thing that I think he demonstrates is not every politician needs to have an opinion on everything in the world. Pay attention to what's in your community, man. That's what we pay you for. and that's whether it's governors or mayors. Like, why are you like commenting on stuff that doesn't have to do with you? Why are you kowtowing? So that is actually, it's interesting. I'm on the liberal side of the spectrum, and I still believe that. And I think that energy is consistent with a lot of folks that I'm speaking with within the Democratic folds as well. I do think there's an energy. I think there's a moment surrounding this populist stuff. So having said that, I kind of feel like you can't also say, all things federal bad, all things states good. I think there are parts of things the federal government can do the state can't. I think there are a lot of things state and local governments do that we don't realize. And when it comes to public health, we've always, the way public health in this country has always been organized is you have state-specific powers and you have federal-specific powers that complement that. And I think that, yes, the issues around COVID, I will completely agree with you. There are parts of that where, even as a public health person, I think that there were parts that the reactions were maybe masks outside. I'm an infectious diseases doc. And I think I posted once, I was like, why are we wearing masks outside? We don't need to, right? That tweet, which had typos in it, made it into New York Times because it was so controversial, apparently, to say that. Like, why are we closing parks? But on the other hand, you have to look at the other side of that, which is that the stands is needed to be, a lot of times in emerging infectious diseases, when there is uncertainty and lives are at stake, someone needs to make a decision. And it's interesting that Jay Bhattacharya is like having to make this decision about quarantines, by the way, around Hantavirus, right? Because he's the guy who was like, no lockdown, no lockdowns. Now he's having to make this decision of like, do I put these patients who may or may not we may or may not know when the transmission happens, do I force them to be in quarantine or not? It's like really hard to be a decision maker in that moment.
And he ordered them, the Americans, to be quarantined.
He ordered them to be in quarantine. Yeah, which is very interesting, right? Like when you're on the other side of it, having to make this decision. So I will stop there. But anyways, I love this energy, and I kind of feel like it exists on the other side of the spectrum as well. And it very much reflects this disappointment in what we're seeing at the party level, higher up, on the federal level.
Thanks, Naheed. Craig, I wanted to bring you in because there's a lot of conversation around the cutting of USAID and the cutting of budgets and support and things like that. In my conversations with more conservative voters, I think there was, for a while at least, some support for the cutting of USAID because there was concerns about fraud and like the misspending of funds and things like that. But I'd love for you to explain and just talk about what you're seeing the real world consequences are. Do you think that has made a big impact in these particular instances right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are people who are going to die in East Africa, Congo, Uganda, and maybe further afield because a 19-year-old named Big Balls had a couple of weeks where he got to have fun and cut a bunch of things in the U.S. government, or Elon Musk got to feel like he was important for a few days. I will also, similar to what Naheed said, like there is nuance here. I think a lot needs to happen at the local level. I think there are things that can only happen at the federal level. That does not mean that I think that everything that happens at the federal level is necessary. I think there's a whole host of things that we can and should get rid of. There's a lot of bureaucracy, whether it's on zoning or housing, but also on health. When it comes to things like USAID, I completely agree. There's been a lot of mission creep. There's been a lot that's been added on. There's a lot of money that's being spent on things that probably didn't have the impact we wanted. The problem was that was built around a shell of really impactful and really important programs that not only helped people and kind of transmit the mission of America being great because America was good, but it also protected Americans. It was a national security investment. I think the initial response last year to a lot of these cuts, primarily, and I think particularly bad from Democrats, was like, trying to double down on this message that is only about national security. And if you're not concerned about this, you're not worried that your mom or your loved one's going to get Ebola, and then you're going to be the one responsible for it. I think that there can and should be more nuance here about why these tasks are important, what role the U.S. government can have, not only itself in supporting things like Ebola responses. 10 years ago in 2014, 2015, there was a need for a massive logistical response to build centers, to get people in, to get supplies in, to get PPE in. Like the best resource in the world was the U.S. government and the U.S. military, like logistics professionals. And they did that, and they helped significantly, not only with financial, but with human and other resources. I think what we're seeing right now in Congo, a place where I've worked, a place where Nahid has worked, it's like an incredibly difficult place to try to stand up a response, to try to lead a crisis response as a crisis is already unfolding. A year ago, the United States pulled out a lot of our money and support for overseas programs. And again, some of it probably was justifiable, but a lot of it was not. We are definitely seeing the direct consequence of that. We are seeing the consequence of saying we're just going to close ourselves off from the rest of the world. But as has been cliche for so long, now he's probably been saying this for 15 plus years, like diseases and pathogens don't respect borders, but they also don't respect cruise ships, and they don't respect planes, and they don't respect bodies that move in search of better care, a better life. And the one thing that I've been trying over the past couple of days to really drive home to folks that yes, the cuts are impactful. Yes, the situation in Eastern Congo is like dramatically worse than what you've heard, and if you've heard or been paying attention to this at all. It is fascinating that I've been asked to go on every single network, every single like program. I didn't know there were like 800 BBCs. I've been asked to go on like every single program except Fox News. I have not been asked to go on Newsmax. I've not been asked to go on other outlets that I would prefer to go on, quite frankly. But the message that I want people to hear is that those cuts have made a difference. They reflect really poorly on the U.S., our standing, and how people think about us and trust us. And they have a huge impact on people who unfortunately are going to die in places that otherwise wouldn't have if the U.S. had continued to provide some of the support that it had for a really long time.
And can I just say also, like, pennies on the dollar, like it did provide us with security. It gave us eyes on the ground. It gave us early signals, ability to sort of, like there's a study that came out that after USAID was pulled out, the conflict levels in many of the places where they were dependent on the aid, right? Because it happened so suddenly, that conflict has gone up. And that's certainly true of the DRC area. M23 militia that took over Goma, that's a city in DRC at the border of Rwanda. It was like, our friend Celine Gounder actually did an article on this. Basically, it was like days after USAID pulled out. So that insecurity affects us indirectly, because the more chaos you have, the more agents, of chaos you might find that may then regionally destabilize the area and then affect us more broadly as a global community.
Jeff, I wonder if I might come to you next to react. I mean, you're in South Texas. You're a member, you said, of the Republican Liberty, I think, caucus, you said. Can you see a reason to bolster federal aid and have a USAID program that can help support these kinds of operations? React to some of what you're hearing right now.
Well, this is interesting. I used to actually work for USAID as an 18-year-old living in Singapore.
What?
So it's kind of interesting. And I was part of my job was we had years of audits that I had to go through, and I had to decide which audits needed to be burned and which didn't. I actually ran the warehouse. And when we consolidated out of volcanoes in the Philippines, I consolidated the warehouse. So I was a grunt worker, but 18-year-old, my school kid, a friend, his dad was the director. So I really saw where a lot of the money went because I had to thumb through the pages. I thought when we went after USAID, I loved how you explained it's like for pennies we got so much. I thought the USAID was a great way to expand American soft power without doing it politically, and we could actually target these areas that, such as Africa, I always thought that Africa, and I always believed that Africa is somewhere where we need to have a soft hand in helping them out. And I think this also falls within the idea of what the federal government is supposed to do. It's supposed to do national treaties. It's supposed to work on our national defense. And like Craig said, diseases have no barriers, especially in the modern world. A great documentary was done by PBS on the Spanish flu. And they talked about, like, during the time of the Spanish flu, every hamlet in America got the flu. Like it went to everywhere. And we're talking about before interstates, before travel, before these things, diseases are going to spread. I think it was unfortunate. I think it was more of a talking point when the Trump administration first came in. AID is not about, we're not cutting funding to important people when we cut AID. We're cutting funding to foreign countries. So it's an easy thing to do. It looks good, but it really accomplished negative. And I'm worried, and I would love to hear what y'all think about what the lack of AID, like I'm glad you brought this up, because this is where we see that short-sighted political jabs really have huge consequences in the long term.
Let me tell you, Jeff, I was not expecting that. But thank you for sharing that. Right, breaking news on Why Should I Trust You? Who's the real leader of MAHA and South Texas Republicans saying that America should have a hand in helping Africa. So we're really breaking barriers here. My question for you all is, I don't know if you've heard this, but there was some American medical missionaries working in Eastern Congo as part of a project called Surge. If you go to Eastern Congo, there are medical missionaries everywhere doing really incredible work in really tough places. One of the missionaries was infected with Ebola while taking care of a patient that nobody knew had Ebola before this outbreak was declared. His wife also had an exposure, and he has 4 kids under 7 that have exposures that are going to be evaluated. The one thing that came of my own illness with Ebola a decade ago is that the United States recognized the importance of being prepared and building a system and having that system on the ready, sustaining it through 3 different presidential administrations, making sure that it was continuously funded despite partisan bickering in the background. And when Hantavirus came up, I reminded people that not only do we have a national quarantine unit, we have 13 hospitals around the United States called Respect that can take care of Ebola, can take care of Hantavirus, can take care of the most concerning, crazy stuff you've ever heard of. Already at a moment's notice to do this. I was at a meeting with them 2 months ago, spoke at this conference in DC for NETEC, which is this consortium. And these dudes were dorking out every single day about how do you get lab samples from this place to this place. This is what they do every day before an outbreak occurs. And I can't stop thinking about the fact that we have American medical missionaries who got infected with Ebola. And the United States response was to send them to Germany and the Czech Republic as opposed to bringing them home. And this makes me so livid for so many reasons. The argument that's being proffered is that it's because it's a shorter flight. I frankly think that's bullshit. We have a system that we as taxpayers have paid for, and I hope we can all agree in the past couple of weeks that the system is really important and shows its value. I'm curious your thoughts. What if you heard that American medical missionaries with Ebola who are exposed to Ebola weren't being brought back to the country because this administration didn't want them in the country, despite us having a set of hospitals exactly prepared for this? How would that hit you, and what would that make?
Can I add
what would that make you think?
Yeah, let me add a bit more flavor to that. I think what Craig is alluding to is when we were both deployed in West Africa in 2014. It's so interesting. My first deployment was in August 2014 in Kenema, this small rural area in Sierra Leone, and I'd just come out of the hot zone, the red zone, taking off my personal protective equipment. It was heart-wrenching. And I think Craig and I haven't really talked about this, but I think his experience was, of course, unbelievably even more life-shaking and breaking, but it changed me as a human being. I lost half of the people I took care of, not because this is a hard disease to take care of, but there's just not enough stuff, not enough people. People were dying in your hands. Kids were dying in your hands. They were crawling towards you for help because there's just not enough people, right? So you come out of that and you're out there, you turn on the television, I've cleaned off. I look on television and the news is covering a tweet from Donald Trump that says, keep them there, don't bring them here. This was when he was not the president. And that's what Craig is alluding to, is this a response from the White House, which is basically saying, keep these people out, rather than anything that's based on our own capacity or even what's good for these Americans.
Aaron, you're a Christian. You're somebody who is, a deep man of faith. Respond to what Craig and Naheed are saying.
All of this is kind of what I think we find our frustrations in as American political, in the political experiment we're in. And that is that you look across the landscape and you realize that most of the time, the things that are in these budget conversations and in all of these different iterations of what's coming out of Washington, most of the time it is punitive to the people who need it the most. The cuts, the conversations about it, when we have a budget shutdown, the national parks are closed. TSA becomes a mess. USAID, there are going to be elements of that are going to be fraudulent. But there's also a bunch of this stuff that is, as everyone has described, what is the role of the federal government if it isn't to have some influence around the globe? That should be what it should be doing. It should be having something there. We have exercised our power with a punch rather than with kindness. And I think if you look at, from my perspective, from a faith perspective, that's the absolute wrong way to win people over to your side of the aisle, to your persuasion about life, about how you live a free life. If we do it by dropping bombs on people and, exercising force, we're not going to see very much conclusion of that. That's very good. And I think that's where the frustration resides with so many people in our country, which is that it always comes after the things that hurt us the most in the places and spaces that matter the most to us. But yet you look at it and there's $40 trillion of debt of what they'll let you see. And people go, well, I don't understand what I got for that. What did I get for that $40 trillion of debt? And also in the midst of crisis, we can't spend any money because now, it looks politically bad to do something through USAID or to bring people home or to do anything associated with it. So we're going to punish people. The people of the country get punished. And I think that's what, if you want to swoop all of this together in terms of Massie and the rest of it, people's frustrations are surrounding the fact that the government operates in spaces it should not and is totally dysfunctional in spaces it should be. I think something like what's happening in Africa is something we should be a participant in order to give the resources. We have them. We can print unlimited money, apparently. We can print unlimited money for anything we want and have no consequences for it. And yet, USAID is the one that's going to get attacked. Certainly there's fraud there, but there's fraud everywhere. There's fraud in everything that's that large and that's that big. And I don't like that our politicians look at it and say the way that we're going to do this is by isolating people into groups and then penalizing those who are politically opposed to me.
I want to actually just bring something up. There's a couple of big voices who are supporters of MAHA who've been writing about some of these outbreaks. And I just want to, you had Robert Malone on May 11th, and he called it, and he was referring, and I want to be very clear here, to the hantavirus. And he was saying, he called it hantavirus and psychological bioterrorism. Fear is one of the most powerful drugs ever invented. And he talked about, you see the pattern, a virus or some other pathogen emerges somewhere in the world. The media shifts into apocalyptic mode. Experts appear to be predicting catastrophe. Computer models project millions dead. And then he sort of draws out, and pharmaceutical companies announce new products. And he calls it this media frenzy, and how the reality is, in his words, far less cinematic. Joseph Marine, who was actually in line to become the CDC director, he wasn't ultimately chosen. He talks about, now 40 days into the hantavirus. In that interval, 0 Americans have died of hantavirus, while 100,000 Americans have died of cardiovascular disease. How is this playing in your sort of media world? When you hear from someone like Craig and Naheed, are you hearing something that you wouldn't ordinarily hear? And is there something that you would say to them about where they can maybe be more useful that they should be saying right now? And Elizabeth, I wonder if I can start with you.
Yeah. I think where a lot of Americans find themselves right now is unfortunately, trying to parse out for themselves how serious, these various outbreaks that we're hearing about are. I think there's a valid concern from some folks in the MAHA movement or folks that are just aligned with Kennedy that, it's a great media story to run with, to say, look at what a terrible job RFK Jr. is doing. Look how incompetent he is. And then to see, well, if I think back, pretty much every 5 years, there's something crazy. There's some kind of crazy outbreak. We hear about it. A lot of folks have a difficult time seeing the difference, seeing when something is a very serious threat to becoming, the next COVID, the next pandemic. I also think, we're asking a lot of the everyday American who is struggling to pay their bills and, keep the electricity on, to ask them to care about things that are, probably never going to reach their communities. And so that the ability to discern when something is serious enough for the everyday American to focus on and to get really enthused about is difficult, I think, for the average American. We are so in this bubble of talking about public health every day that I think it's easy to forget that that's where most people are right now. I'm friends with Craig, and there's doctors in my orbit that I could talk to about these things, and that they trust that I am talking to about these things, and they'll come to me and they'll say, "Is this real, or is this just like media hoopla?" And this conversation that we're having gets exactly to the core of what is different this time around, which is how we respond to these things. Because yes, diseases do come around, periodically. We're always going to hear about the next hantavirus, the next Ebola, the next coronavirus. We're a lot more aware of detecting these things now. We have the media capability to project these outbreaks to the masses in ways that we didn't 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so I really think there's a big adjustment period for the general public to decide, when is it that I'm supposed to care about things? And unfortunately, as we know, public health becomes so politicized. But, I just want to tag on something to what Craig said earlier about these medical missionaries not being brought home. And I think that is truly emblematic of how political this has gotten in so many ways, because what I hear when I think about that is, what a small price to pay for those people who, were doing something heroic to not feel alone. And to think that these systems were built and designed so that they had the faith that they could go do something like that and they would be taken care of is heartbreaking. And I don't see it as all that different from the Americans, the American civilians who we left behind in Afghanistan. And I also think about, the people who died alone in nursing homes in America during the pandemic, and how so often we find ourselves asking, is it worth it? Is it worth the risk of potentially bringing, Ebola or hantavirus into the United States to bring these people home? Is it worth, the risk of potentially, losing more troops in battle to bring these civilians home? We've got a lot of work to do in answering those questions. But to Aaron's point about the humanity aspect of this, and that, to get good, you have to do good. I think, we are really in a moment here where we have an opportunity to learn so much from all the mistakes in the past 5 years. And I hope we do.
I want to say something to that too, and maybe I'm out of turn here, but I think this is so much about just grace and sort of love for fellow human. I mean, these are our citizens and they're suffering and we don't want them home. I understand the terror, we're about to have a World Cup and people are concerned about disease spread and everything. And I think it's possible to be concerned and figure out mitigation strategies and then signaling to someone that you don't want them there. I mean, I know Anthony Fauci draws up a lot of really strong emotions amongst folks in MAHA, but there's a picture of him circulating from back in, I guess, when Craig got Ebola, where somebody was a worker and he came back and it was a picture of him hugging them.
Fam. Yeah. the nurse from Texas, right? I think.
Yeah. And I just like, we need to be that country again. Like we can't be so selfish and self-interested. It's just not going to work. So on that note, Craig, I'd love to give you the final word here. How has it been hearing from these folks on the call? And what do you think you want to, think about all this stuff moving forward? That wasn't a very well-formed question, but I'm mostly just asking you to help me close out the conversation.
Let me just quickly start by saying I did a bunch of interviews in media last week on hantavirus, and my main message was like, stop freaking out, people. Like, this is not it. And I did an interview and posted something on LinkedIn that Elizabeth Frost reposted and put a comment on that was the message to the MAHA community to be like, I think you said, the answer is not to minimize or look away, but instead prove that we can respond rapidly and adequately while learning from yesterday's mistakes. It meant a lot to me to, one, to have this relationship with you, to two, to have you share this with your own community. And I've been getting so many of these messages of like, what are you hearing from the MAHA community? Do they just think that like we can fix Ebola with ivermectin, and do they not care about the rest of the world? And I'm like, I don't know who you people are talking to or who you think these folks are, but the people that I'm talking to, the people like Jeff, the people like Elizabeth, the people like Aaron, none of what you said, well, I don't know, working for USAID in Singapore, I didn't expect that with Jeff, I'll be honest with you. But nothing of what you said surprised me because I know you all and I know you to be good people. I know that we disagree on a lot, but there's a lot that we agree on. We share the same values. We love our country. We love our colleagues, and we love our citizens, and we love the people that work to protect us, whether here or abroad. And I would love for us to think about how we reframe not only this discussion around Ebola and what the U.S. should be doing, not only around, our politics, like at this moment of intense political fracturing that seems like it spills into every part of our life. I would love if we come back to exactly what we do here is remind each other of our shared values, what we really care about when it really matters. And I think everything that you've all said about what our commitment should be, about why we're good, about our own values, what we share, like it means so much. And I don't think that's a message most people are taking from either yesterday's primaries or this outbreak in a far, far away place that many people don't feel like hits home, but hits home for so many of us.
Look, I couldn't agree more. Naheed and Jeff, I just want you to know you are both officially regulars on Why Should I Trust You? Like, we love you. You were fantastic. I also think it could be cool when you guys go back to, because what naturally happens, we return to our silos, right? Maybe take some of this message with you that you're hearing from everyone here and maybe have it inform a more nuanced message. I think that is just one little role that our show really loves to play, is to bring these groups together so that when they do go back to their groups, they carry a little piece of each other with them. I want to thank Craig Spencer, Naheed Badilia, Jeff Hutt, Aaron Everett, Elizabeth Frost for joining us on Why Should I Trust You? That was a phenomenal conversation. My name is Brinda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. Dr. Mark will be back with us next episode. Please send questions and comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net, and we'll see you right back here next week.